Today we look at the Nimcha. This is a extremely iconic sword and one that, let's say, once you've seen and recognized, you cannot forget. It's also a sword with a very long and interesting history that is shrouded in a bit of mystery too. And any good story should have a little bit of a mystery element to it as well. But before we address the things we don't really know, let's talk about what we can discuss. And let's start with its area of operations, perhaps. This is a North African, generally speaking, sword. While its use developed in a very vast region, so we're talking about the whole of the Mediterranean basin to an extent, and down the east coast of Africa to Zanzibar and the south of the Arabic Peninsula. This is a mostly North African sword, specifically countries on the Mediterranean coast. Morocco, but it was also used in Tunisia and Algeria as well. Another element of certainty we have around the Nimcha is the unusual hilt. It has the very unique and interesting hilt. So you can see it here, but we'll dive into its details in just a moment. So I won't focus on that right now. Moving into its timing, its like heyday, things already get a little fuzzier. But what we can say is that its period of main use goes from the 16th century, perhaps, to the well into the 19th century. So a very, very long time of use. As for how this kind of sword came to be and its early history, that's a little more mysterious. There are a bunch of different opinions and theories around it. It may have been influenced by Arab swords. It may have been influenced by northern Italian swords of the late Middle Ages. So there are elements that are consistent with a lot of different possibilities. Who used the Nimcha? That's another question we may want to ask, and this is a bit of a tough one to answer. In a lot of resources, you'll find it described as a sword that was in use by the Berber pirates. So it makes sense. It's usually a short sword with a nice, solid, easy grip. It's not going to slip away very easily. And we know it was used by sailors or by seafarers. It was also used on land, so this was also a sword that was used in the traditional way sidearms would have been used in Europe as well. So when the battle comes to close quarters, then you unsheath your short sword that is good at slashing and you go for it. So it would have been used together with rifles and as a, let's say, close quarter kind of weapon. So a very broad picture, let's say, one that makes it really difficult to define specifically what this sword was and who would have used it. The answer is probably anyone could have used it within the time frame we're looking at. It also was a bit of a fashion statement or a status symbol, we can say, especially in the Arab Peninsula. Very fancy versions of these were often used as high status gifts. By the way, this sword was also adopted by Europeans. So from sailors to merchants to admirals. So two really good examples that come to mind are Dutch. One is Cornelis Tromp, and the other would be Michiel de Ruyter. So these are like, check them out because they're really interesting historical figures, but these are like the top tier of Dutch Navy, Dutch naval warfare. And the fact that they chose to adopt the Nimchas is a testament to the fact that these were probably not just adopted as status symbol or fashion elements, but they were appreciated for their effectiveness in combat. But before we dive into the specifics of this Nimcha and look at it close up, let's first take a look at what characterizes a Nimcha on a broader level. Let's start let's start in general. The Nimcha is a single-handed sword, so generally a rather short blade. The blade length can vary dramatically. These were not mass-produced swords, so we don't have like standards or patterns. There's not like a fixed version of a Nimcha, but long enough or short enough that it can be easily handled one-handed. Another characteristic is that it's a single-edged blade. So of course, blades come in all varieties. They may have false edges, but generally speaking, this is a slashing sword with a single-edged blade. Moreover, the blade is curved. So perhaps the stereotypical version of a Nimcha blade would be almost like a storta blade, so rather beefy and broad, made really for the cut and the slash. Now, you'll probably see that mine is not that. Mine is barely curved at all, actually, and is rather slender and thin. And that is because, as I mentioned, there are no patterns for the sword. There are all kinds of blades were hilted onto Nimcha hilts. And when we talk about blade variety, this opens up a whole interesting topic, because it's very common that you would find European blades on Nimchas. A bit as you would see with cascaras as well. With the difference, and this is just me speculating though, that while the cascaras in many cases are local blades made to imitate European ones, I would imagine that in a lot of cases on Nimcha blades, you're seeing authentic, actual European blades, and this is simply because of the use Nimchas had. These were swords that were often used by people who were involved in kind of Mediterranean level combat. So they would have had easy access to battlefield, or maybe actually I should say ship deck finds, so they could easily probably pick up a blade that they liked and hilt it onto Nimcha. So in any case, you'll find a whole bunch of European blades with the typical Sulingen markings, the sun and moon, the eyelash kind of markings. And these blades can be really old too, but they can also be relatively recent. So for example, if you saw my video on the Nueva Granada briquette, you'll have seen that it's marked Nueva Granada with the date, 1845. And I've seen at least other 2 of these blades that were mounted on Nimchas. And this kind of also opens the interesting topic of how these European blades were sourced. Lots of times when we think about Nimchas as being used by pirates, we can think about the found blade, like the war trophy, let's say. But there's also a case to be made for these blades being sold as part of surplus, for example. So in the case of the Nueva Granada ones, one hypothesis is that these blades were produced in Europe for Nueva Granada, but when the country evolved into a new entity, these were then sold to someone over in Morocco, for example, or in some way they reached the North African coast and became Nimchas. Anyway, that's so much for the blade. It's a really interesting rabbit hole, and you can dive into looking at Nimchas all day long, and you'll probably enjoy it. But maybe its most characteristic feature is the hilt and grip. So really quickly, what we have on there are variations, of course, there are different overall typologies of Nimchas, but what we usually see are these upturned quillins that are kind of parallel to the blade, and often in 3. So we have one on the blade on the cutting side of the blade, and 2 over on the spine side. We also see another characteristic is the grip. This is usually made of horn. Sometimes it's rhino horn as well. That's quite sought after as well as a material. It's very, that can add quite a bit of value to Nimcha. So learn how to recognize it, because if you find one, that may be very cool. But in terms of its characteristics, what makes it unique is, well, first of all, it's rather broad and thick, but it's this 90-degree kind of turn here at the pommel area where it moves horizontally, and this recess for your finger. And this, I have to say, this sword isn't slipping or going anywhere. It's fixed. It's a through tang, so it's fixed. It's pinned in place at the end here. And overall, this is kind of what you need to know about how to broadly recognize a Nimcha. With the caveat that there are a few non-Nimcha versions of Nimchas, if that makes sense. So for instance, if you're familiar with the glaive of the École de Mars, this was a French Revolution era kind of military academy, and their cadets had a rather beautiful sword designed by David, the artist. And it's basically a Nimcha-shaped sword. It's really cool. Check it out. Anyway, let's look at the details of this Nimcha. Okay, so let's look at this Nimcha close up. We'll start from the blade. If you already saw the cleaning video I did, you'll probably already recognize it. So what we have here is a rather slender blade, as I mentioned. You'll see the curve is not very pronounced at all. It's not sharp, which is why I feel comfortable running my finger on the edge, although, yeah, it might have been at some point. I'm not, yeah. And it has a rather shallow fuller running from under this kind of langet. It's not really langet, it's like something to keep it in place. You have it on both sides here. So it's decorative, but also you can see it kind of sandwiches the blade in place there. And then the fuller runs from underneath that on both sides, very near to the spine, and then it kind of drops off and tapers away in the last third of the blade, I would say. In terms of distal taper, you'll see the thickness of the blade kind of keeps more or less stable up to maybe just after half and starts tapering down towards the tip. And it's a rather simple blade. I haven't really been able to look it up and figure out, kind of date it or anything. So if you have any suggestions, that would be really cool. Moving on to the hilt, you'll see that it has the 3 quillins I mentioned, but you'll also notice that they're not 3 equal quillins. One is actually the continuation of the D guard here, of the knuckle guard, whereas these 2 just kind of pop out on the side, on either side of the blade. So what we have here is maybe the most common version of a Nimcha hilt, and it's the one with these 3 quillins that kind of run more or less parallel to the blade. These you'll find relatively commonly on 18th, 19th century Nimchas, so relatively late, and mostly from the area of Morocco or North Africa. Of course, with this kind of sword, it's probably really difficult to come up with precise typologies. It's already difficult sometimes for mass-produced swords. But another common typology is what is normally called a Zanzibari Nimcha, which would be a Nimcha from the Zanzibar area. So as I mentioned in the introduction, the Nimcha was then used all along the east coast of Africa as well, up to southern Arabia. And in this case, you'll often have instead a kind of ring guard here. Sometimes the tips of the quillins are kind of connected by a ring. And this, as far as I understand, is the Zanzibari kind of Nimcha. And there are also some differences in how the pommel area of the grip here extends out or curves. So that can also let you know if it's a Moroccan version or a North African version versus a Zanzibari version of the Nimcha. Now, still looking at the quillins here, another fairly common characteristic of Nimchas is that these quillins end in what is, at least in English, referred to as a bud finial. So you see they kind of end with this, they bubble into this little bud shape. So this is really, really common on Nimchas as well. As for the grip, this is a obvious later addition. It's just a glued piece of red velvet. I don't know why it's there. You'll see the grip is kind of damaged. It's not in the best shape, especially in this area. You'll see it's kind of breaking off in some points. But what's really interesting here is that I found out that these horn grips were shaped and heated. So it's not, I never really thought about it much, but I guess my impression was that they'd take a horn and simply carve it or shape it into whatever shape was needed. But of course, horns are often hollow, at least to a certain point. So what would happen to be able to use them and shape them? And this also happened, by the way, in European swords too. These horns would be heated and then kind of pressed into a block or into like a shape that then could be carved out. So I think that's interesting because here you see a whole bunch of, I don't know if that's because of the heat work or whatever, but it's almost like lava, right? Something that's been molded into a shape and compressed. And so I think this is really interesting. Also, another beautiful thing about this hilt specifically, this grip specifically, and I don't know if it will come through, is that it's almost translucent in some points, like here. It's hard to see because I don't have a strong enough light, but if you hold it up to the light, in some points you can almost see through it. So it's really, really very, very cool. Now, I mentioned that some of these Nimchas have rhino horn grips. And these are, I would say, not impossible to recognize. I'm by no means an expert, but usually you will have, they're a very consistent brownish color and they're very tight grain. So it's a very uniform kind of material. And you'll be able to see, I'll share some pictures because, well, this isn't rhino horn, but they have very characteristic fiber. Like if you cut it through, you'll see a very typical grain of rhino horn. Moving on to the last characteristic that's really kind of something that we want to consider and look at is how the blade is fixed in place. So of course it comes through the horn, and sorry for my dirty hands, I've been cleaning swords, so I can't seem to get the residue of oil off of them. But they're fixed in place through kind of a button here. So in this case, you have here this iron button, which then the blade is pinned onto. And I think that's it. No markings, no decoration or anything that we can spend some more time on. Just a very lovely blade in a very, very iconic hilt. So I hope you enjoyed seeing this Nimcha, and I'll see you soon with another sword video. Bye!